Right, so let's get political with very young learners. You can read that, can't you? But always I like to start with a little bit about me. I actually come from Redcliffs in Christchurch. I'm a Christchurch South Islander. And my mountains, you can see them there, Southern Alps, and my river is Heskett River. But the rock in the middle there of that photograph is now smashed right down. So where the birds are going to sit, I don't know. But the earthquake did quite a lot of damage to this part of my world. The top right is my father and mother. My father came from Yorkshire and my mother from Scotland. And that was the car that my dad made in the Depression. And then my husband and myself, we've been married for 53 years. And we have 3 children and 9 grandchildren. And very proudly, my daughter is here tonight. I feel quite emotional about it. It's very special. So we lived in Mount Eden, and now we've moved to Mount Victoria, Takaranga, and I have a very different people, places and things to connect with. So that's who I am. I'm now an honorary this, that and everything. I'm an honorary research fellow at the University of Auckland and an honorary editor of the first year's Ngātou Tuatahi Journal of Infant Toddler Education. So tonight I want to discuss people, power and change, which was a slogan I picked up in the recent election. It makes sense for early childhood. So I think for me, politics is the process of making those decisions and organising the distribution of power and resources. And I want to begin with an example of an ethic of care in New Zealand in the early part of last century, when resources resided pretty much just with people who had the power or took the power to make change. So this story begins and ends with advocacy. So moving beyond care per se, New Zealand later changed its focus from social welfare to education, through to a curriculum in 1996, along with confusion in qualifications. So the working conditions for teachers have meant frustration in trying to achieve children's potential in partnership with families. There's now much more research emerging regarding an infant toddler pedagogy, but I question whether student teachers are sufficiently exposed to the theories and research regarding this. If there is a drive towards a specialism of infant toddler education and care, then teacher education will need to change. So we all need inspiration, and in fighting so hard for ethical care, Mother O'Bear is my heroine. I see the top has gone off the top of that slide. That's all right. So there were several other nurseries in the early part of our history in the past century, but I've chosen to look at this example. Susanna Bear came to New Zealand in the mid-20th century from France and started the first foundling home in the 1880s. She's really quite a remarkable woman. She did lots of other things before she got to Wanganui to do the foundling home. She went to Hawke's Bay and then later in Auckland. She certainly was very staunch in her beliefs, and the conditions for children at the time were often very bad. So care referred to protective care and led to Mother O'Bear really wondering, I'm sure, if people did care. So she opened the first ongoing childcare centre in Buckle Street, Wellington in 1903, and then the Home of Compassion in 1906, with huge community support to get this up and running. But I love the story. I know many of you will have heard this, doesn't hurt to hear it again, and that is that she was quite remarkable at funding these services for women. And often, for example, women who were in prison came on Sundays, and the nuns would make their clothes and have them looking beautiful so that when those mothers came, they could see that their child was well cared for. But anyway, so she would often go to parliamentarians early in the morning when they were fresh, and she went to see this politician one day, and he said, "Come in, mother, come in, take a seat." So when she left, she took the chair, which I just thought was so clever to actually walk out. I mean, it made a point. And so I think, it's I wonder what sort of things that we could do to make those political points. She was a brave, courageous woman. And because she believed so much that women shouldn't be chained and they wouldn't give their name because that was their business, she went to see the Pope to advocate for women so that she could set up the Home of Compassion and actually have it so that women were in quite a private situation. And she would be able to run that Home of Compassion according to her beliefs. So she was a very strong woman. So she's my heroine. Right, done that. Now, I love these two metaphors, and this was from a book in 2009 by Munro and Rack, and this, I'll read it. The sisters must identify themselves. So that's interesting, isn't it, for a start? And that's what we have to do, isn't it? We identify themselves with the children and families, sharing their joys and their sadness, smile being for infancy, what a warm ray of the sun is for young plants. And love is the life of the heart, and like the pendulum of a clock which sets in motion all the other parts, love gives to the soul all the movement it has. It is by loving that we learn to love. Much harder in those days too, actually. No washing machines or dryers or things like that. So I guess one of the things that Mother Abir had actually said was, mind your patience. Because it can't have been very easy at all. She said, be patient with the child whom your impatience will not calm. So these are the roots of our first childcare in New Zealand. I think they're very beautiful metaphors. But care began to be seen through a very different lens due to ideas from education. The previous century, certainly the infant was regarded as a passive learner, needy, and to be protected. Whereas in the 21st century, very much more the interactive infant is seen with capabilities and rights. And a real shift in thinking from straightforward physical care. In Hungary, the photograph on the right is Pickler honouring views of abandoned children through the belief in using care moments for authentic relationships. So we've moved away from managing babies to the development of a pedagogy which involves understanding learning and understanding teaching with subsequent policy shifts. But the pivotal move was to a values-based, bilingual and inclusive curriculum which also placed us on the world stage. But despite this message of a clear focus on infants, practices were slow to change. So the sector now had a curriculum. However, the specific early childhood diploma of teaching qualification had only been achieved 7 years earlier, coming after a confusing system of points to equate a variety of training programs. So the turn of the century was to be the turning point. From the 1st of January 2002, all new persons responsible were required to hold the diploma of teaching. I used to think everybody was responsible, but there was somebody nominated as the person responsible, only one person generally before at the turn of the century. However, these were very early days to grapple with the curriculum, with a new assessment package, as well as the drive to increase the numbers of qualified staff. But in the meantime, working conditions were not ideal. So despite having the curriculum, some of the things that affected our practice need to be acknowledged. And qualifications, as I've said, was a bit of a muddle. There were policy changes, but they were often put in place and then taken away again, and working conditions suffered. So an ERO report expressed concerns. Teachers talking at children rather than interacting. This is 2009. Teachers not taking more time to listen and respond. Now, could they, basically? Teachers not interacting with children during meal times because they're focused on cleaning tasks. Well, let's get some help with the cleaning tasks and maybe that might make it easier. So very serious concerns were beginning to be acknowledged, and this report from the Office of Children's Commissioner was the first one that I saw that said review the initial teacher education would be a way of helping providing specific infant toddler content. Graduate teachers had a limited knowledge in this field, and they found initial teacher education programs targeted to the teaching of older preschoolers with little or no training on infants and toddlers. And a teacher's voice coming through here, and that the regulatory regime has minimum standards that are too low, and the content in teacher education programs are too meagre. And if there's not a standalone paper with the words infants and toddlers in the course title, it's easy for the wording that includes infants in the course outline to be overlooked. I remember setting up the paper on infants and toddlers and the advisory committee coming in, and I hadn't actually put infants and toddlers in the title, and I was quite impressed by a member of the committee who said, you need to have infants and toddlers in the title. I now know why. So many lecturers not having expertise or specialist knowledge in the area and therefore falling back on what they know usually with older children, and a lack of research This is 2011, with infant teacher pedagogy is responsible too. So again, New Zealand research giving voice to these concerns. Catherine Bussey, 2012. Participants had hunger, and that's what I've found too, that they're like a dry sponge, you know, just please, just water me to be able to fulfil my function, and looking for points of difference in their initial teacher education. And again, the PhD thesis saying a number of participants commenting on the lack of infant toddler content. So you can see why I had the passion, because I haven't been able to understand why everybody else doesn't see what I see, you know. I guess I swim around in a goldfish bowl, but it seemed to be pretty obvious that we needed to change things since Te Whariki, which, let's face it, has a third infants, a third toddlers and a third young children, but that wasn't reflected in the teacher education programs. This recent report, of course, from ERO in 2015, I think stirred things up a great deal. So over half the centres had responsive curriculum, but struggled to encompass the communication and exploration strands. And that New Zealand and international research pointing to structural elements of quality, such as ratios, group size, etc., and teacher qualifications as important factors, but that not in itself teachers' theoretical knowledge and their knowledge of infants and toddlers' emerging interests. That was another very important thing to consider. And of course it got into the media. So we had a week in April in 2015, the Herald, with a series of reports on the status of early childhood. And we don't often hit the media. Usually it is bad news, anything to do with bad news, early childhood's in the media. So that fulfilled that concern. But variable quality, so I think that's something we're familiar with. Leadership management practices, certainly not up there. Impact of private for-profit sector. Teacher quals, group size ratios, and teachers' working conditions. And in a University of Auckland recent research project with graduates, they expressed concerns about disconnectedness in their professional lives, that they were wanting collaboration, something they'd enjoyed during their qualification experience. Social media too, open discussions on working conditions as well as teaching. That's been an eye-opener for me. It's been a privilege actually to be able to have a look at what's happening on social media. So the Working Together site, which is a fairly recent one, is Garrett here? Garrett? Ah, Garrett. Wonderful. The work that you do on that site is really so stimulating. Thank you so much. New Zealand ECE teachers, and how many people actually are on those blogs? Wow, look at that. Yes. Yeah, I'd say that would be third to half of you. Yeah. And NZEI, obviously, and the first years. So that's my aim now, is to get active on that. But it is very interesting, actually, to hear on social media about teachers' concerns, because these are real voices coming through, you know, with real situations. Child Forum did a survey in 2014, and it's interesting to actually look at those issues. Lack of time to develop relationships with children and their families, insufficient management support, poor teacher-child ratios, long working hours, understaffing, and I know that's been a problem in Auckland, feeling undervalued. That shouldn't happen, but that's sad to see that, and high risk of emotional and physical burnout. So despite there not being funding for large studies, you know, we have been, in fact, able to access the voice of teachers. So I think this environment really, with several concerns, led to Jane White having discussions at an international conference and learning about a large study in the US. And she went ahead to develop an Australasian collaborative, Cupid Down Under, an Australasian collaborative for understanding pedagogy of infant toddler development. And it is a 4-year study. So this is part of the larger study with 17 American universities, 2014 to 18. And the purpose is to learn about student characteristics and how undergraduate courses for a BA teaching degree in early childhood will influence students' views on child development and teaching with infants and toddlers. Basically, to develop a literature review, to develop a set of competencies to guide practice. And this was the initial list of the 9 competencies that I think we can all relate to. It's interesting that health and safety is top of the list. It's something that I feel often is pushed aside because it's maybe not seen as education. Having visited Mexico, was very impressed with the way the health issues were integrated into early childhood education, particularly around nutrition. And when I got back from Mexico in 2013, I could see the distance that we've created between funding for health and funding for education, and I'd very much like to see them come together. Reflectiveness, understanding, supporting relationships, supporting learning, child guidance, which is a very interesting discourse, partnering with and supporting families. It's funny, I've never really sort of got away from that notion of partner, and yet it's something that we often don't see. Anyway, there you go. Assessing development, learning and environments, and diversity and inclusion, and professionalism, and I think mentoring is going to be part of that. So that was their initial gasp. And so with Jane, she is an amazing woman. At the moment, she's off flying around from Finland. She's been all the way over through China to Japan, and now she's back in Sweden again. So it'll be great to hear her talk when she gets back. So she and Dr. Mira Peters are the lead researchers through University of Waikato. And so in New Zealand, really we haven't got funding. It's just the support through University of Waikato and each of the institutions that are represented, I suppose, smile fondly and support us. So we have Professor Andrew Gibbons there and Janita Craw, who's here from AUT, and then in 2015 these were the extra people that were brought on board to try and spread it throughout New Zealand. So we've got University of Canterbury, Glenn Mackey and Michael Gaffney at Otago, and in Australia Sheila Degatadi, who will be known to many of you, and a new lecturer coming on board since 2015, Maria Hatskiani and from Macquarie, and Professor Margaret Sims, who of course you know is a New Zealander working in Australia, and Berenice Nyland from Melbourne. So it's got a big team. So initially, so it's all done basically with surveys, and Dr. Peters is the person who is actually managing the data. So initially there were 78 students and 24 lecturers. So you can see it's a very small study, and I think the idea of it is to be a stepping stone so that other people will come along as a result of this and carry on with larger studies. So we can see, I think, that University of Auckland is the green at the top there, and primarily the University of Waikato, the orange, is the largest with the Macquarie. And the lecturers, again, green, University of Auckland, RMIT Melbourne on the other green, and Macquarie and University of Waikato, the larger ones. All done on the smell of an oily rag, really. There we go. So this is just one example of one of the small pieces of data analysis that we've done so far on student assignments, so that you can see that we have here observations, live observations, not video, 4 no and 9 yes. So that seems to be, observation is something that's coming through actually as being critically important. Research to practice assignment, 3 no, 10 yes. So that seems to be the popular research to practice, which sounds very sensible to me. And literature review assignment, 3 yes and 10 no. So that's a very interesting thing in itself. I did mean to mention that it is the Wilf Malcolm Institute for Educational Research at the University of Waikato, so I need to say that because they are supporting the research. So, what we had a summer scholar, and she was the person that was able to pull some of our data together. So she's been looking at first year practicum experiences and the infant child pedagogy as a specialism, or is it to be an integrated component? We found that there was definitely quite a complex nature of this interpretation and timing of delivery, but it's funnily enough, the findings concur with the US study that there's a lack of consistency across the sites. So under two, it's very interesting because we have this under twos and over twos, you know, which has come from licensing, and yet Te Whariki explains toddlers' age range of 1 to 3 years. So something that we found that was a bit tricky was that the practicum is mostly in the under twos if you're going to look at infants and toddlers. But we didn't have any in first year in our site because we've tended to, and many other universities have felt the same, that it's really not appropriate in the first year, a little bit more on knowledge on board before they go to work with infants. And yet, what about these 2s to 3s? So we had quite a bit of a puzzle to know how we were going to get that data. There's always going to be problems or challenges, aren't there, with research. So this was what it was about, how universities responding to national and local university requirements and practicum with birth to 3-year-olds. And so we had 18 lecturer surveys. We had the document analysis from each university site, mostly gained from the website to see what the promotion of it was. 27 practicum reports from students, associate teachers and lecturers. And the reports were analysed using Vivo software and inductive thematic approach. So the key similarities and differences, and I do find the Australian situation quite hard to get my head around, because I think we're very fortunate in New Zealand. We are such a small country that we are fortunate in that we basically have one set of everything. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. So all practicum experiences must be planned with clear links to the initial teacher education program and located in licensed centres. That's obvious. But the difference is really New Zealand do not have a mandatory requirement that student teachers must have an infant placement. They must experience a range of socioeconomic, cultural and learner age settings. So I don't know whether you're all aware of that, but I found that quite interesting. Whereas Australia has an age focus of qualifications, so they do have birth to 2, 2 to 5 and over 5. And they have a compulsory 10-day placement, which isn't very long, let's face it, 10 days. How could you really do much in 10 days? So the time spent on practicum over the teaching qualification is defined by each country. So we have a minimum of 20 weeks and Australia requires 16 weeks. So if we were looking at the espoused practicum of practice and what actually happened, we were looking at qualitative analysis of the lecturer surveys and the thematic analyses of practicum report entries by students. I see VLs, visiting lecturers, university, what are we, university supervisors, we're now US, and associate teachers. 40 themes, 4 dominant categories, obviously, curriculum and how the program was described and planned and enacted, children, respect, and routines. So no surprises there. And this is what was promoted, the idea of the interrelated nature of student learning, building relationships with children, staff and whānau, learning experiences, care routines, cultural responsiveness, reflection, observation and assessment practices, and managing and organising the learning environment. So that was the overview that was documented in practicum booklets. What did come through was the value of the triadic relationship, no surprise there, that quality mentoring, feedback and feed forward positively contributed to student practicum and the deepening knowledge of infant toddler pedagogy. Don't expect you to read those, and I'm not reading them out. It's really just to remind us here of that valuable triadic relationship. And of course, the mentoring that goes on in early childhood services is absolutely invaluable to student teachers to actually be able to get support. And I have to say, I have met some amazing associate teachers who are so dedicated, and it's so valuable for our student teachers to have that experience. So the key findings really is that the field is highly complex and nuanced, and it does lead to diverse pedagogical approaches and priorities. The timing is something that's significant of the practical and theoretical engagement, when to put it, and where the practicum is located and how it's assessed and how many years the program spans. The 1-year graduate students were not involved in this. It's the 3-year undergraduate degree. Yeah, I could just pause there before I move on. So at this point, we've got a lot of work to do. One of the things that we're going to do this year is actually have a focus group with the 3rd years, and then we, of course, next year with the 4th year. It'll be very interesting to get the thoughts of people who have actually gone through their qualification and actually had a year's teaching. So it's a very exciting project to be involved in, but without funding, it's been a bit of a struggle. So again, it just gets down to the determination, one might say, of people who are trying to find out much more to be able to help students. But I do want to talk about the new directions that I think that you've begun to when you get old like me, so you can look back and you can see each decade is quite different, and you can see how change has occurred. And so for me, I've always been fascinated with the words infants and toddlers. And so infants, of course, means no speech, and toddler means you can't walk properly. What an insulting term that is. And I mean, what I've managed to find out is that toddler actually came from the United States. It was a clothing label because they wanted to get something that was in between very young babies and those 4-year-olds that were very energetic. So what came in between? A toddler. Who thought that up, I don't know, but that's the origin of the word. But it's interesting to see how discourse is claimed by people, and I don't think we're going to shift it. But I would love it to be explorers and communicators, because this seems to be coming through. I mean, if you look at the ERO report, it's the exploration and the communication is something that's highly valued. And they certainly are amazing explorers and communicators. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. It is interesting to see the discourse in the UK and in Europe is much more children, up to 3. And I've also been involved just recently in an international project with, we're still at the proposal stage and we've been shortlisted, and that's US, Hong Kong, New Zealand and UK, and it's something that's interesting me about the way people are describing themselves or the children that they work with. So I find that discourse shift very interesting. The shift from supervisor worker, I mean, that's a fair while ago now, I think, that people were called workers, and very much that sort of industrial on the floor model. But I think that we are now moving to the professional, and I think that's probably why the media is wanting a lot more accountability in terms of our professionalism. It's still a tension, isn't it? You know, we still have people who are unqualified, who are brilliant and experienced in actually doing superb work. So there's a lot of tension in the field, I think, at the moment between people who are feeling uncertain with the political situation and qualifications. And I remember leading up to, in the 90s, coming up to, you know, it was going to be the turn of the century, and that's when you had to be qualified, and then the turn of the century came and went, and we're still battling with the qualifications. But I think the notion of a caregiver has probably lessened, and we did move to educator to be much more inclusive. Then this whole new thing came in, being a pedagogue, you know, very much a European, very much not in our own language, but that seems to have taken a little foothold. Primary carer, I think it is becoming more common now to be a key teacher, so you can see the shift in the discourse from care to teaching. And then that even in the latest, you know, the Te Whāriki coming out in 2017 with Kaiako sort of shook some of us up, I think, you know. How was it? And again, you know, that sort of tension between being inclusive and yet being pay your money, get your qualifications sort of thing. Where does that leave us? And also, I was talking to my daughter recently about the teacher aide. You know, there's a lot more now recognition that there are people unqualified and that they would like to be a teacher aide. So maybe that's a new discourse. I haven't really seen that in early childhood, but it's definitely here now. And something that's always fascinated me is this shift from being task-based into pedagogical. And I think that we have made that shift. We have gone from an apprenticeship on how to do things, you know, and how to carry out these tasks, into how best the children learn. I'm just thinking another shift possibly is the teacher-directed into the inquiry-based learning for very young children through play. And there's still a bit of a tension, isn't there, in there? And so I find that quite fascinating. And I looked at things on the internet, as one does, and I found this last year actually from President Obama, and I'd probably not like to find anything President Trump this year, but so I'm relying on this one. And I just picked up these few words and I found it quite fascinating. This was to an address at a university, how we communicate is important. Well, where does that start? It starts at birth, you know. I mean, this is where, if it goes wrong, it's going to go wrong. Frustrating. The pace of change is accelerating, and boy, do we know that. I don't know whether you've been watching The Year Million on television, I think it's on Sky. It's absolutely unbelievable. And then we have this incredible presentation coming up very soon, in October on the 11th, on looking at digital technologies and new methodologies. I mean, it is fast. And I know that my mother lived through a generation of no electricity, no toilets, no radio, obviously no internet or even digital watches or anything like that. And that's a generation, but it's much faster than a generation now. Moving towards cooperation, innovation and hope. Very powerful words that he's used. And qualities like kindness and compassion, honesty and hard work really matter. So that was inspiring. But I think the philosophical impact is another thing to consider when we're looking at teacher education and pedagogy. And I think, aren't we lucky? You know, we're just so fortunate. I love this document, Te Whātua Pōkeka. I think it's a wonderful document, so if you're not using it, I would highly urge you to do it because it's so helpful. And that whole connection with the Māori pedagogy is holistic, with the 4 dimensions, spirit, mind, body and heart. Both learner and teacher engaging, you know, we're familiar with that with ACO, and I think that we're incredibly lucky to have those philosophies. And to a kanataina, and I hear that a lot too, that Pākehā are actually articulating this process superbly, and it also matches with the scientific, the mirror neurons, you know, that by learning through imitation is very, very powerful for very young children. And you can see the incentive in this photograph of older ones, you know, being so inspiring for the younger ones. Beautiful image. That was in a journal article by Karen Liley. Yeah. So we've got lots of things to discuss and to think about in terms of pedagogy and our teacher education. And I think that consideration and collaboration and cooperation, very much cross-cultural values, participation in symbols of communications, appreciating child's capabilities and children being adaptable and resilient to stress. Now, you see, there's another discourse coming in. Children are adaptable. They're not just problem solvers. There's a discourse around being adaptable, and doesn't that fit with the 21st century? Those sorts of concepts. And stress, and resilient, I meant to say. Stress. So in a way, we're coming that full circle around from Auber's setting up Learning to Love, Obama's concern for cooperation, innovation and hope, along with those qualities of kindness and compassion. And I think we could have a pedagogy of hope, a pedagogy of compassion, pedagogy of love. And the contemporary research is focusing on love. And I don't know whether you know of Jules Page's wonderful website, and of course Rachel Hughes' work on love. And so I think that's incredibly important to me. I think it's very much a link. So just thinking of some of the political shifts, I had a struggle to see if there had actually been any shift at this point in time, but paid parental leave, of course, 18 weeks now. National are proposing 22 over 2 years, slowly. Labor, 26 weeks within the first 100 days. So that at least has got things moving a little bit. But ratios are in desperate need of an increase, and currently 1 to 5, Australia 1 to 4, 1 to 3 to 1 to 5 in the US. That's what I mean about New Zealand being a small country. It's quite complex in the US. 1 to 3 in the UK. I hadn't quite caught up with that actually. And the interesting thing is that the Greens, Labour and New Zealand First have said they will review ratios. So I think that's pretty amazing. To me, it's actually group size. It's something that I think, I know we can't regulate for it, but I think group size is something that almost needs to be regulated, because I think that some situations you have very large groups and it's very noisy and stressful, and it's not fair on teachers and it's certainly not fair on children. So we have to do something. We're going to have to start stealing chairs from politicians or something. So in terms of qualifications, it's interesting, isn't it, with our recent election. Labour proposed moving from 80 to 100%. Greens, New Zealand First, both Greens and New Zealand First, 100%. And the National is just status quo. So, as we know, there has been a spotlight on early childhood education policy. You wouldn't know it if you were listening to the media, would you? I don't think early childhood has been mentioned more than once. And Associate Professor Jenny Ritchie from Victoria University put together this wonderful chart, which I'm sure you've seen it if you've been on the blog and studied it before you voted. But it is interesting I debated whether to show this, but I think it is very interesting to see, okay, so in that top line you've got the 100% degree qualified teachers required, ticks, green, Labour's definitely going to move to 100 and New Zealand first. And if you see green, I don't know who was doing the early childhood policy in green, but certainly must be somebody with their focus on early childhood. You'll see nothing in National's column because they've really only talked about extra funding. They haven't actually talked about any specific policies. But New Zealand First have, and I think the improved ratios for infants and toddlers, so it's check with Green, Labour and New Zealand First. So it's quite adventurous for New Zealand First, I think. I'm sure you're aware that in the past, steps forward have tended to come from Labour. Cautiousness has come from National. So it's interesting to see that we're at this point in time where we're not quite sure in which direction we're going to go. I think in terms of equity factors as well. But for me, it was actually interesting. Jenny did this, I think, for her students. It's interesting to see how each section has been broken down very neatly. Support for parent-run early childhood services, definitely Greens and, yep, I forget who's at the top now. Oh, Māori, that's right, the Māori party, which of course we're not quite sure what's happening there. So they've definitely given their support for families and early childhood. So I don't know what you think about that, but it may be that time is right, actually, to try and... I mean, I've already emailed Winston Peters, as I'm sure most of you have, and said, I urge you to whatever. So, that's just a little thing that you can do, and we can talk about it on the blog and to talk about it with families. But unless we actually have some action like stealing chairs from politicians, I don't think things are going to change. And it does seem very unfair, doesn't it, that you feel that sense of helplessness, and yet everybody knows that it's the early years that there's a new report, Nora was saying today, that the UNICEF have brought out a new report on the significance of those first few years. And yeah, could rave on. So the conclusion is really that there are still tensions between structural working conditions and qualifications, and providing an environment of emotional predictability within a context of exploration and communication. This is critical for optimal learning and development. And that it is about advocacy. So, okay, we started with advocacy. We started with Aubert going to see the Pope. She got trapped there in Rome during the war and had to stay there for quite some time. But she managed to get the Pope's ear and got permission to go for it with her Home of Compassion because she had money to pay for the land. So if you want to read about any of our early childhood history, I would highly recommend that you look at reading about Suzanne Aubert. If you wish to have a heroine that inspires you, I'm sure we've all got these inspirational people in our lives because we do stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before. No doubt about that. So we do need to speak up about good working conditions. I firmly believe that. I think that if you've got, well, I've always said pay peanuts, you get monkeys, but that's a rather rude thing to say, isn't it? But we certainly should pay people like professors who work with babies. It is the most important job that anyone can do. So we have to take that power to make change and research the issues. And that's been very exciting for me over the last few years to see New Zealanders doing their PhDs and doing research in their institutions. I think that might be the last slide. Yes, this is the last slide. So I think I've finished with plenty of time for questions and comments and thoughts. It would be great. Thanks, Adrian.
There's no doubting Jean's passion. We absolutely know. We've had many times together where we vied for our passions in various areas. Mine, of course, in the field of dance and movement, and Jean with her babies. But I've always loved babies.
Of course, and they love you. Yes.
There are so many things in this presentation that I'm sure many of you have many questions to ask, many provocations. Prime platform here. She's challenged our institutions to actually look at what we're doing regarding infants and toddlers. I can't see anything when I put my glasses on out there, so that's all right, but I have to read something here. I read something from Dewey some time ago about babies, and this has always stuck with me, and I think it reminds me a little bit of what Jean is actually referring to and how we actually see our very youngest citizens. The wisdom of earthling babies is an amazing topic. It is one we ponder extensively and still only scratch the surface. Sometimes we often wonder if babies are born with an all-knowing repertoire that gradually erodes away as they encounter situations. And I think this is the challenge that actually Jean has laid down for us. This raises the question, particularly for me, how we view the very young child and how this view influences our interactions or engagement with our very youngest citizens. And I think when you started talking about the language you use, infants and toddlers, I'm going back to this youngest citizens. You had it in your sheet here. Because I think they are our citizens. They are a part of us. They are with us always, so that they can have other names. And I think this also talks about appreciating a child's capabilities. So I guess I don't want to quote another thing that you said too in another article you wrote. The time of infancy is a time never to be repeated, a time that is to be beneficial in terms of an infant's being's humanity for all of us. So you had another question here, but I've got another question here too. What are student teachers now learning about infants and toddlers? I'm just going to open it up there. And so I'm opening it up in a sense if you've got any questions related to these points, how we now view infants and toddlers, have we changed our view from history, and what is now happening in relation to learning about infants and toddlers in our programs.
Don't all speak at once.
Any questions you'd like to ask? Other challenges? She had qualifications, working conditions, lack of research.
Hi, Jean. I was just wondering, in the current climate with capitalism and neoliberal policy kind of driving regulation, do you think that's a direct conflict with our contemporary research around love and incorporating love into infants, toddlers, pedagogy?
I'm sure it is. I mean, it must be, surely. Because basically you're looking for the monetary advantage in the market economy as opposed to the wisdom of the very young and the gifts that they'll give us to humanity if we don't wear them down. It's a very thought-provoking question. I mean, I can only give you my response. Other people might disagree. But we're on the verge of change, aren't we, in terms of, well, who knows with the next couple of weeks. But we could be on the verge of shift from more of a market-driven economy. Yeah.
Can I just add, love can be commodified just like everything else, like respect.
Yes.
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 Kind of making it meaningful.
Isn't it scary, commodifying love? Oh. Yeah. Put a big bow on it. It doesn't hit the media very often, except in television, I suppose, in certain ways.
I think some of the neuroscience research is steps towards commodifying love in some ways because it gives a kind of value and purpose to caring in terms of brain development.
Yes.
So that can be a discourse that we can use to our advantage, but also need to be a bit wary of.
In what way do we need to be wary of it?
I think we need to watch the way that it's measured in, I don't know.
Should we be found wanting in some way? Or,
Yeah.
you know,
Or,
is there-
some things you can't put a price on.
Hmm.
And it's harder to spread that love and commodify that love when you're dealing with a large group size and high
Well, it doesn't have to be an either-or polarity, does it? I mean, you can, in your individual life with children, love them, and you can still be part of the market-driven economy. I mean, you can actually do both, because one is an individual and the other is state power. But I guess for a sector of the community, you're going to have a much more difficult time if you've got a dysfunctional family unit to actually have that love expressed. So love matters, you know, like that film title, Love Matters. But I'd like to hear from Rachel, actually, who's doing the research. How are you finding it?
It's very slippery terminology, and what I've been reading just lately is that teachers are really scared to talk about love because parents are asking, what does that mean? What is this love? What do you know, I love my child. What does that love look like from a teacher's perspective? So that's what I'm looking at my research.
I think that notion of learning how to love is perhaps something that might reassure them that your child is learning how to love, you know. But certainly there is that loving relationship rather than love. So yeah, I think you've got a lot you will give us that you'll be, you know, contributing to ways in which teachers will find it easier in communication around this. Yeah.
I think that's something I've been thinking about lately, and one of the things, in fact, I ended up expressing it to a parent the other day, is that I like to say to them, really thank them for the gift of the time that we spend with their child, given that their circumstances aren't allowing them to do it. And that, I think, changes the relationship between you and the parent. Their child is a gift, you know, that you are given the care of. And so when they hear that, the relationship with the parent alters from the point of view that they do wish to know that you have that love for a child.
Yes.
And that you express it. Maybe not as love, but at least in terms of loving looks.
Yes, yes.
Loving expression, loving touch. And it isn't the same love as a parent's love. But if we can articulate that with parents, it makes a difference.
Good to talk about, isn't it, with parents? Yeah.
But Jean,
Yeah.
you know, one of the tensions you brought up there is you know, the sort of regulatory stuff.
Yeah.
And I think we have something that we can do in terms of advocacy is that we have regulations from the ministry, but alongside that, the ministry constantly has recommendations or statements about best practice, and the two things
Right.
are often not matching. And I think we have to actually take those things and say, no, you need to do something about regulating for this. You know, you said it's a recommendation, and your recommendation
Exactly.
is not working.
No, that's right. And I think we have to face up to that. You're quite right. And I think of group size in that sense. And I think of ratios of qualified staff. You know, one person is sufficient for a huge area.
Well, and also, you know,
it's not.
The way they keep, they calculate the statistics, you know, to say that we are, you know, 98% qualified. Well, they're counting my 110% qualified.
Right.
If somebody else is 50.
Yes.
And that's crap.
Yes.
You know, if
Yes.
you're at 50, you should be counted as 50 and declared as 50.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
not wrongness altogether.
No.
You
Well,
know,
they're saying, as you say, recommending, they're saying, well, good practice looks like this. You wouldn't have the person that's qualified inside and nobody outside because it's good practice, but there's nothing legally to stop any from doing that.
The 150 licence can have 50% qualified.
Yeah,
Good practice is to ensure that 50% in each of those groups
exactly,
is existing. But
exactly.
then they'll qualify it by actually adding a thing to say, but what the owner decides to do is their prerogative.
Well, there we see we've got this tension, haven't we, with the business model. And I think in terms of privatisation, you know, it allows people to have their passion and to set up in situations where they can do things for themselves. But then we've got to balance that on the other end as a continuum where there are other pressures coming down from people who aren't directly involved in the centre, at the heart of it. So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty amazing sector. It is really challenging that most of outside society don't see. They don't see all of that. But when you're in it, you can see the contradictions and the difficulties.
And most of the outside society's attitude is, it's good enough.
It's good enough, that's right,
I
that's
choose
right.
this place, you know, it might not
Yeah,
be, but it's
yeah,
good enough.
yeah. Well, the three areas for choosing a location, you know. So it really, it's a bit of a worry.
On advocacy, of the different sort of topics you mentioned, if you had to choose one most important thing to advocate for or against for change, what would it be? If you were advising somebody who had resources to advocate or to bring about, try and bring about change, innovate, what would the one point of greatest leverage be?
It's very difficult because I've got my personal view as group size, you know, like I sort of feel that, again, it's unlikely, it's never been regulated and it's unlikely to be regulated. So it does rely on people's intelligence and compassion and qualified knowledge to actually make that decision. So, yeah, oh boy, that's a tricky one. I don't know, what do you think? Yes. What would you, magic wand, advocate for? What's the most important thing? Oh, I don't. Yeah. Tell them. I know, I can read your mind.
Jean, why do you keep going back to saying that group size is unlikely ever to be regulated?
Well, it hasn't been regulated before, and I haven't heard much about it at all. And it's, in ministry speak, I suppose, not sufficient research, to actually make the change. But thank you for that. I think that is important. I think when you do have something you want to go for, you go for it. And that would enable all those babies to be able to move. If you had, space is another thing, isn't it? It's disgraceful. We really haven't been making any changes. And really, it's time that we put our foot down and said, well, I hate going to the media because I think that it's very unpleasant for families. But in a way, the media is the only source of real quick, fast change because everything else is so slow. What do you think we could do for changing to group size?
Well, I can't see why we can't advocate for that to be a key regulator.
Yes, yes.
Other things, regulations, they change very slowly, but they're never going to change if we don't advocate.
It's exactly right.
But actually,
Yes.
they don't change so slowly.
Oh, they change overnight.
Yeah, that's right.
They change overnight at will without any announcement.
Just before Christmas is when they do it.
The things about home-based care, was you have, 4 children.
That's right.
And now, suddenly, you can have 6. You can actually have
Yes, I
older
saw
brothers
that
and
the other day.
sisters or
That's
somebody
right.
else who's a school age come in.
Yeah.
So 6 children, some of them being infants and toddlers, with a person who's unqualified.
Yeah.
And seen once a month.
Yeah. Yes, you're quite right.
In terms of advocating and forming a voice, the uptake of memberships to unions is minimal at ECA. It's even less in private ECA. That's the biggest problem. So the thing about power is that it's better done as a collective. And collectivism is the best way of gaining power and doing something. So my advice to everybody here, if you're not a member of a union, is to join one. Preferably the ECUA.
Just give us the information about the new union that you've set up.
Early Childhood United Aotearoa. We're a newly formed union. We're completely grassroots at the moment. So we're looking at building a voice just for the ECE sector. NZDI has been fantastic for kindergarten teachers over the years, but there is a bit of it hasn't been acknowledged. ECE hasn't been acknowledged since 2009 on any kind of a scale. And a perfect example would be last year, in 2016, when the bulk funding thing happened for the primary schools, we weren't featured very often at all in the ECE sector. So, and we still are, we're victims of that bulk funding scheme. So, ECUA was born out of that particular situation and the poor working conditions of teachers in Aotearoa. So, if you jump on Facebook and type in ECUA, you can bring us up.